This is Kevin Lin from Luminate LSAT, and this is going to be a video on how we handle rules that involve or but not both in ordering games. So let's say we're doing a game that involves adding ingredients to a soup one at a time. And one of our rules says the ranch dressing is added before the barbecue sauce or before the sriracha, but not both. How should we handle this kind of rule? Well, whenever I get or but not both in a logic game, I'm going to start by diagramming and visualizing each part of the or statement first. And so what I mean by that is ranch is before barbecue or ranch is before sriracha. Let's go ahead and diagram that. Now, ordinarily on the LSAT, when we have the word or, there's nothing about that word or that prevents both sides from being true at the same time. In other words, normally these are not mutually exclusive options. If you just took off this but not both, if you pretended like this but not both was not there, then what this means is R is before B or R is before S, or maybe R could be before each of them, both of them at the same time. But now that we have the but not both, you can think of this or as now creating two mutually exclusive worlds. If we're in the R before B situation, then that means the ranch cannot come before the sriracha. And if you're in the R before S situation, then that means the R cannot come before the barbecue situation. Now, a lot of times students will just go ahead and write the words but not both right next to their diagram. But the problem with that is it doesn't actually visually capture what this but not both means. And so here's what I want to do to capture what that but not both means. We're going to start off in the first world here, R before B, and then we're actually going to draw out what it means to not be in the other situation. So here's what that looks like. If we're in the R before B situation, I cannot put the R before S. I've X'd out the relationship that we cannot see here. Now, if this is a game where each ingredient is being added one at a time, or in other words, you can't have multiple ingredients added at the exact same time, then what's the relationship between R and S if R cannot come before S? Well, of course, it's got to come after S, because R is either before S or after S if you can't have two ingredients coming at the same time. Now let's go ahead and do the same process with the second world. If we're in the second world, then that means we cannot have the R coming before the B. And again, if this is a game where you can't have multiple ingredients coming at the exact same time, then what's the relationship between R and B if the R is not going to come before the B? Well, it's got to come after the B. So let me go ahead and clean up these red markings here, and now we see how you can diagram this or but not both rule. If ranch is before barbecue or sriracha but not both, what that means is the ranch is going to be stuck in the middle in between them. Sometimes you can think of this kind of rule as like a sandwich rule. The R is sandwiched between the B and the S, and the B and the S are going to be potentially switching places. Now, I want to note that sometimes people will take a rule like this and they'll diagram it like this, where they will put an S before R before B, and then to signify that the B and the S can switch off, they'll do like a switch to show that it could be B in front or it could be the S in front. Now, there's really nothing wrong with diagramming it like this, as long as you understand what it means. But I prefer actually to draw out both possibilities explicitly, particularly because it helps when we start attaching other rules, because we can actually start attaching other rules to each of these possibilities and maybe draw and split this game into two possibilities up front. Sometimes when people keep the rule like this, they don't easily recognize that other rules might be able to connect to this relationship. And on this page, let's go into an example of what I just talked about, how you can actually connect an or but not both rule to other rules in the game. So the first rule is going to be barbecue is added after the chicken stock, so C before barbecue. The second rule is going to be chicken stock is added before the mayonnaise, so C before mayonnaise. And then the third rule is the one we had before, ranch is before barbecue or before sriracha, so ranch is before barbecue or before sriracha, but not both. And so if it's but not both, that means S is going to come before R in the first situation, and B is going to come before R in the second situation. So let me start by connecting the first two rules here. The C is going to come before the B and the M like this, So now do you notice that we can actually split the game based on this OR statement, because in one possibility the S is before R is before B, and I'll go ahead and draw that like this. And in the other possibility, we'll go ahead and put the B before R before S. So let me start by going ahead and drawing OR, and then recopying our combination of C before B and M. And now I'll add on the B before R before S. So now we've combined every rule in the game, and the game should be much easier to handle because we're either going to be in this situation or we're going to be in this situation. If it turns out, by the way, that these 5 letters are the only letters in the game, there's only 5 ingredients in our soup, not a very delicious soup, but if there's only 5 ingredients in our soup, we can actually start to make some deductions. Do you notice that in the first situation here, only S or C could ever go first because only S or C are the letters that have nothing that has to come before them. So you can actually draw something like this where you have 5 slots, and because we know S or C are going to occupy the first slot, I'll just draw S/C. And do you notice in the last spot, it can only be occupied by B or M, because these are the only letters that don't have anything that has to come after them. So here we're done with our first world. Let's go ahead and make deductions in the second world. Do you notice the C is coming before every other letter, so that means the C has to go first. And do you notice that the last slot has to be occupied by either S or M, because those are the only 2 letters that have nothing that has to come after them. And one last thing that I would do in this situation is I would actually cross out this C from our ordering chain here, because we already know that this C is going to go first if we're ever in this situation. So in the end, this is what we're working with if we find ourselves in this part of the OR statement. You're going to have an M that can go in any of the last 4 slots, and then you just have to keep in mind you have B before R before S. This M could go in between or before or after any of those letters. So let's take a look at another example of a rule that involves or but not both. This is going to be a little bit different from the other one. In this game, we're keeping track of the number of votes that candidates won, and no 2 candidates received the same number of votes. The rule says Nanders wins more votes than Buttigieg, or fewer votes than Klobuchar, but not both. So I'll go ahead and diagram each part of the OR statement first. Nanders is going to be winning more than Buttigieg, and I'll put more on the left, greater's on the left side, fewer's on the right side. The other possibility for this OR is Nanders wins fewer votes than Klobuchar, so G is going to be before N. So now let's go ahead and apply our not both, If we're in the first possibility where N is before Z, we cannot have the G before N. By the way, you don't necessarily want to write out this G before N and then cross it out. I'm only doing that to help you visualize it, but ideally you'll be practiced enough at this kind of rule to just do this in your head, although there's nothing wrong with writing it out. So if this is a game where you can't have 2 candidates getting the same number of votes, then what's the relationship between G and N if the G is not going to get more votes than the N? Well, that means, of course, it's going to get fewer votes than the N. So now let's turn to the other possibility. If we're in the G before N situation, then we cannot have N before Z. And if the N's not going to come before the Z, then that means it's got to come after the Z. So let me go ahead and clean up these red markings here, which, by the way, are things that I would be doing in my head. I wouldn't actually be drawing those out, although there's nothing wrong with it if it helps you understand the rule accurately. But the goal is we're going to draw these possibilities. Don't just write the words but not both. Actually visually represent what it means to not be in the other situation. So let's see how we can use this or but not both rule to split the game into 2 possibilities up front. So the first rule says Nanders wins more votes than Vroomberg, so N is before V. And the second rule is Klobuchar wins fewer votes than Gang. So that means that G is going to come after J. And then the last rule, Nanders wins more votes than Z, or fewer votes than G, but not both. So let me go ahead and put N before Z, or N is going to come after G. And now let's go ahead and add the not both. So in the first situation, if N is before Z, then that means N is going to also come before G. And in the second situation, if N is after G, N is also going to have to come after the Z. So let's see if we can combine some of these rules. Do you notice that the first two rules, they don't mention any letters in common, so I actually can't combine these right now. Let me go ahead and combine this n with each part of this OR statement. So you can see that I've combined our n before v with each part of our OR statement. Here the n is before the g and the z, and over here the n is after the g and the z. And now let's go back and try to combine our j before g rule. That's the one that was left over. You can see that it's a little bit difficult to add the j before g here because the g is in the middle. Now, you know what would be a terrible decision? A terrible decision would be to try to draw the j before g right in the middle here, because that wouldn't make any sense at all. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move the g over here, and then I'll just put the v on the bottom. And once I've done that, it now becomes easy to add the j before g. In the second world, it's actually pretty easy to add the j before g. I'll just add it on like that. So now the game should be much easier because we've combined everything and we're only working with these two possible ordering chains. Let's go ahead and add some further deductions. Do you notice that in the first world, the only letters that can go first are J or N because those are the only letters that have nothing that has to come before them? And the only letters that can go last are the G, the V, or the Z. So you could go ahead and write G/V/Z over here. So now let's take a look at our second world, and do you notice that the N and the V, they have to come after all the other letters? And so that means the last two slots have to be N and V. And since the N and the V are now forced to go into specific spots, we don't need to represent them on our chain anymore. All we're working with is J before G, and then a Z that gets to go in any of the first three slots. That's why I've just removed the N and the V, so it's a little bit easier to read what's left. And if you want to go a little bit further, you actually know that the first slot is either going to be J or Z. Since the G could never go first, it doesn't have enough room for the J before it. And then you also know that this third slot here is either going to be the G or the Z, because the J is never going to be able to fit there. This second slot can actually be any one of these letters, because you could put J in 2, G in 3, or you could put G in 2 and J in 1, or you could put Z in 2 and then J in 1, G in 3. Before I leave you, I want to do a quick recap of what we learned. How do we handle or but not both in an ordering game? Well, first, make sure you diagram and visualize both parts of the OR statement. These are two possible worlds for the game. And then make sure you draw out what the not both actually means. When you're in one part of the OR statement, you're in the negation of the other. The other part of the OR statement cannot be true when you have the but not both. Make sure you draw it out. That's the key to this type of rule. And then the last tip is when you have or but not both in an ordering game, or really any game at all, it often is a good way to split the game up front because or but not both creates two mutually exclusive possibilities. You're either in one or you're in the other. So if you follow these rules, I think you'll actually start to look forward to getting or but not both in an ordering game.